All right, what's up, everybody? Today we have Dr. Andrew Bauman with us. He is the author of many books that you can see behind him if you're watching on YouTube, and we'll list all those in the show notes. But the one we're going to dive into today is almost a year old, right? Since I think it
Yeah,
was published last January.
January 21st. So yeah, coming up.
Yeah, but this man has taken on kind of what we're fired up about here at Steadfast, which is how to make the church healthier and more safe for people. And so last January his book Safe Church came out, and it's just full of great stuff, which we're going to jump into today. And just practical things too on how do we even do that? Because a lot of us talk a lot about, and we've got to do something. But he really gets into, okay, how can we navigate this and maybe have a safer church moving forward? So, Andrew, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, to jump off today, I think, um, Tiff and I have heard a lot about you. We've listened to you on other podcasts, we've read your book. But for our audience, would you just tell us a little bit about who you are and then also just lead into kind of what was the catalyst for this particular book for you? Like, what got you fired up about this topic?
Yeah, so my wife and I, therapists, we run the Christian Counseling Center for Sexual Health and Trauma. Yeah, kind of how I got here, how I got into this work, deeply, deeply rooted in my own story. So my father was a pastor and also a sex addict and a drug addict, a abuser, kind of lived a hidden life, abused my mom, and that set me off on a certain trajectory of life. So at age 7, my family blows up and my mom goes numb from the betrayal. And I am a deep feeler, deep kid. And I start feeling all these things. And yet there's no language to kind of name what's going on in my world. We go to church, 12 times a week. And the conversations are not conversations of my heart. They're not conversations of why my family blew up, not conversations of my father's infidelity, his betrayal. And so my inner world becomes very disconnected from the external world that I'm living. And so that kind of sets me on a certain trajectory of kind of 12, 13 years old. I find pornography that begins to soothe all these emotional wounds that I was running from and didn't have language for. And so for the next 13 years, abusing pornography, but also equally learning and becoming a pastor. So I have these two very strange worlds of growing up in purity culture and Southern Baptist church and sex is bad, but also, well, it's kind of every man's battle and everybody struggles with porn. And so it's kind of normalized. And so I have these competing narratives around sexuality and my sexual development. And the church is silent about sexuality, and yet porn is teaching me how to abuse and degrade and objectify women. And so that was kind of the early development of my sexuality, my spirituality. And then I don't know how long it's been since I've been sober, 15, 16 years, as I kind of left ministry and began studying therapy, realizing this is not who I want to be. Like, wait a minute. What I learned, my theology began to really inform a misogyny that women are less than, that it fit. How is that possible? That my mixing, my degrading view of women, it kind of began to fit with an oppressive theology that I grew up with, that I was a pastor in. And so it's not because I was a bad guy, but it was because of kind of slowly this pornographic mindset had really seeped into my body. And it really began to inform how I read scripture. It really began to inform how I saw the image bearers of God in women, but also myself. So that was kind of the beginning of changing my life, changing, again, my sexuality and becoming a healthier man. No longer kind of living out of just my own wounds, but actually running towards my wounds, healing those core wounds. And so began to tell the truth of my story. I began to face, this is 20 something years ago. I ended up in a psychiatric ward, nearly taking my life. And that was kind of the beginning of me in diving into my deepest shame, my deepest fears, and in that, finding the depth of my purpose.
Gosh, Andrew, that is thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
Um, I think too, like, what comes up for me is what can happen, and I think does happen so often, is unless we're looking and we're unpacking, then we're just sort of reactively going through life without even realizing what we're projecting out to other people.
Yes.
Um, and so even what you're saying about, like, the messages that were maybe even coming out of your mouth as you're leading this congregation and not really dealing with any of your own stuff. Um, I do wanna slow you down a little bit and just talk a little bit more about what was that process like to start looking in your suitcase?
Yeah. I mean, terrifying, right? To stop and to face my darkness. It just reminds me of we cannot taste resurrection without crucifixion. And so in many ways, I had to die. I had to face that I was an abuser, that I had become my father, that I had to tell hard truths and not to shame myself or not to um, you know, because that would just push myself further into addiction. But to tell the truth is the doorway to liberation. Um, Not only that, it's to begin to grieve my story. To begin to grieve that 7-year-old boy who was left alone. I still remember kicking rocks down a gravel driveway. We moved to this farm in North Carolina, yet without my dad, and not really knowing why. Right, and I'm all alone. My older siblings won't play with me, and I remember the searing shame that my only friend was a neighbor boy named Ryan, and he was 5, but he had great toys, but I was 8. Like, I still remember that. Like, how am I bearing shame at age 8 that my only friend is a 5-year-old? Like, so I'm beginning to develop this inner world that's not also talking out loud about it. So developing
Mhm.
that sense of grief of I no longer have contempt for my little boy, but I can actually begin to care for him, love him well. And now I am in charge of that orphan boy inside of me that I can tend to when I'm feeling insecure or when he's reactive or defensive.
So good, and I love what you're saying too about, like, the power of beginning to name things, and when we start naming things, it's when we can work with them, but when we're afraid to name them or we don't even know how to name them, it's really hard
Yes.
to even do the work.
Talk about this all the time, just the power of naming it. Let's if we're gonna talk about hard stuff, we're gonna get into that deep shame, we're gonna get into this your story, let's put a name to it, and then let's, deconstruct it a little bit, like, where how did it get there? Like, what beliefs contributed to it? What teachings? What experiences? And I have found that when people are sharing stories from, like, their own, like, church hurt, church abuse, almost all of them, if I think back on what's similar, is that it started with someone coming to the church with their story, something going on in their life, and they're like, "I need help."
Yeah.
And then the response was a variety of things. It can, but the response has not been, "Come in and let us help," you
Mhm.
know, which is what it should be. But almost every single time, it's like, our life is our testimony. As you were talking, I'm a mom and I would never want my kids to get to a spot, however, that might be where they need to go in their story to do what they need to do. And but for us to do that, we need support. We need people encouraging us in that.
Yes.
So as you're talking, I was drawn to just, man, he's done so much work. Like, I can hear the work that
Yeah,
you've done.
I can too.
Like, this is amazing. You're what I would want a client to be in, 5 years. Like, he's done the work. And it's almost like we want someone to get to a spot of freedom.
For sure.
And to get there, we have to look at what's on the inside.
Yes.
Even if
Exactly.
the feeling is, I'm going to die. Like, this is going to kill me.
So often tell clients, how do you want to die? Right? Like you're dead either way. Do you want to go out with integrity? Do you want to go out fighting for goodness and living in truth? Or another way to say it, would you rather be a fool or a coward? And those are your only 2 options.
I love too what I'm hearing about, like, you taking authority over the messages that you're believing about yourself. As you're going through this story there were things that that young 8-year-old believed about himself that now you're able to parent that part of you through, and, "No, that's not who you are, buddy. Like, that's not who you are." Um, yeah, I love it. What do we see that maybe are some issues in the church that need to be addressed?
Yeah, so back to my research on Safe Church. Basically, 2018, I read a study on sexism in Silicon Valley, which is male dominated in the tech industry. And it was fascinating, heartbreaking research. And so that kind of got me thinking, well, I wonder what that's like in another male dominated space that I know very well, the church, as 87% of churches are male led. And so that was kind of got my wheels turning of wanting to do this research. So for the last 5 years, I worked and interviewed and had a questionnaire over 2,800 women who worked in the church. And so these are women on the front lines of ministry. Let's see, most of them middle age, 35, 45. Majority of them were white. So we definitely need to do some more diversity to understand the problem in other cultures. But most of them, let's see, 26% had worked in the church for 5 to 10 years. And then 16% had worked over 25 years in the church. Isn't that wild? So we've got just a large amount of research from women who've been on the front lines of ministry. They are defining their experience. So I didn't want this to be some theological mansplain of, oh, let me tell you about women. I wanted this to be an actual, like an investigative journalist of like, well, okay, I remember being a male, pastor with my other male buddies leading this church, but women could serve us food and why we did God's work. But like, I didn't really understand. I didn't actually know, what is that experience like? Can I get out of my privilege and actually like understand women's experience? So for maybe some of the women, some of the findings might not be surprising, but they were for me. 82% out of this is almost 3,000 women believe that sexism, right? Sexism is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or stereotyping because of someone's sex, played a role in their church. That's wild. So sexism is alive and well for women who are working in the church. And so some of the other large findings, 62% of women said they wouldn't be surprised if they heard a sexist joke in the church, right? I mean, I remember growing up, women in the kitchen, women drivers, ha ha ha, right? Like these are normalized acts of aggression, but they've just been said, no, this is what we do. Even women can learn to laugh at themselves, and it's called just a joke. And so many people, women, shared what the so-called joking felt like when they would confront sexism, right? I remember one woman shared, she walked up and the group of men were joking how to increase church attendance, right? Joking in air quotes. And so they said, well, we just need to have the women wear white t-shirts when they are
My
baptized,
gosh.
and that'll increase the church attendance. Ha ha ha. Right. And so the
My
woman,
goodness.
right, felt incredibly uncomfortable, incredibly disrespected, right? Imagine just the war in her own body, confronting those men, right? So many of these women are like, well, it's just a joke. Get over it. Or don't be such a prude,
Mhm.
right? Beginning to blame them. One pastor honestly saying, this is a male dominated industry. Got to get used to it if you're going to be here. That was what one of the women were told. So these are just so normalized, these so-called jokes. And I write about Dr. Thomas Ford's research out of Western North Carolina, where he studied sexist humor. And he said, telling sexist jokes increases tolerance of discrimination. And it also works as sexist humor acts as a releaser of prejudice for men who have antagonistic attitudes towards women. So basically, he's saying it almost lets the pressure out of the sexism that's already there. So
Mm.
it actually gives us, it's a tell that is already in these pastors that are making these so-called jokes, that actually is just, it's part of the sexism that they already have, their antagonistic attitude towards women that's already present. So another big finding, 5.1% of women reported suffering from sexual harassment or some form of sexual misconduct, or they answered it's complicated.
Mm.
That I mean, that's 1 out of 3 women. That's wild that the church is not much different than the world, right? And then 77.9% women felt like the opportunities in ministry was limited due to their gender, right? Stories of one woman, Hannah, sharing, I got my master's of divinity from Harvard, couldn't find a job, so I had to change to dominations. Gail sharing, she was an experienced worship leader. She said this direct quote, was kept from being hired as a worship leader, although I had been filling in for the role for over a year. I had a degree in music, more than a decade of experience, but I couldn't be hired because I was a woman. Even though leadership agreed I was doing an amazing job, exceptionally qualified. The man hired in my place was a far less capable musician, far less capable administrator, and a far less capable music director. So these are some of what the women are saying in some of the big findings in my research of almost 3,000 women, and they're
I was
heartbreaking.
gonna say, how many people said that they had the title of administrator?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I heard so many times my husband was the youth pastor and he just taught and I did all the work.
Mm,
Or the pastors would hire my husband and say, "Oh, I get a 2 for 1," because they knew I was going to be doing most of the work. And so it's this free labor, right? It's this exploitation of women that has become the norm of ministry.
yeah. I mean, that's something that I know Beth Allison Barr touches on in
Mhm.
some of her books, but, it's almost just it's so odd that in this world, a man may go for a job interview for a position at a church, and his wife is part of that, like, job interview process. Like, what other industry in the world is that even a thing? It's
It'd be
just very
so
interesting.
so inappropriate. It's just so inappropriate in so many other industries, and yet as church, it's the norm.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and when I hear some of this, I have a sarcastic part that comes out, I'm like, how many people think they're gonna get to, like, see Jesus when they get to heaven and are gonna get a high five from Jesus by saying, "I kept the woman in their place," you know?
Yeah,
Like,
I
Jesus is
know.
gonna be like, "Well done, good and faithful son."
Right,
I'm like, "No, I don't think
right.
that's gonna happen at all."
And that's,
Right?
an entire chapter of my book because it's insane to think about. Let's look how Jesus engaged women. Do that in a completely patriarchal Roman culture. The early church is on the cutting edge of gender relationships. They are empowering women. Apostle Paul calling them co-workers. There's just so many women literally fueled so much of the early church, financed so much of the early church. And then when we look at Jesus and his engagement with women and how countercultural it was. The woman at the well. I mean, just a wild story of this woman who is just oppressed not only by Jewish people, but also by her own people and looked on as just trash. And he asked to share spit with her, essentially, which, back in the day would send a Jewish man to hell if you shared spit with an unclean woman. All right. You look at a woman in Luke 7, the alabaster jar, right? He's honoring his relationship with women, empowering them. You look at Matthew 15:21, the Canaanite woman. This is a wild story that he basically is, in a sense, in an argument with a woman, which is so cool. And she takes him on and,
Mm,
in a sense, changes his mind and commends her for her power. You look at Mary Magdalene in John 20:13. Jesus is entrusting one of the most important truths of the gospel, the resurrection, to a
right.
woman to share, to preach to the masses. Go tell everybody. This is beautiful. Jesus must be the guide to our church, not patriarchy, not misogyny, not our unaddressed wounds, right? Not our projections. Jesus
Right.
empowered women and gave them a platform and a voice. And I think we need to do the same. And so if Jesus is actually our guide, then that confronts so much of the misogyny that has been masquerading as theological truth. And it's just wild how much gymnastics they have to do to discount Acts 2:18. I'll pour out my spirit on both men and women will prophesy, or Galatians 3:28. There's no Greek, Jew, slave free, male or female. We are one in Christ, right? Like all these things that destroy hierarchy right? Where actually I think what it is when insecure men who have not done any of their healing work are in
Mhm.
charge, they're terrified to lose their power because they think that we're just trying to create another oppressive class, that women will then treat them like they've treated women,
Mm.
which is not the case. We're not advocating for another oppressive class. We're advocating for mutuality because I believe in the Imago Dei, that God's face is in our face. And so
Mm.
we can't have objectification and the Imago Dei. It's oil and water. They don't mix, right? So we actually get to know God more fully when we embrace mutuality.
Totally.
I'm reading a book by a woman Hebrew scholar, and she's talking in Genesis, and I love Genesis. I love the garden. Like, there's so much in Genesis 1, chapters 1, 2, and 3 that I could be there the rest of my life probably. But there's verse in Genesis 3, and I'm pretty sure it's Genesis 3, when God, he's saying that he's created man and woman, and that's the reflection of his image, internal and external, but it's man and woman. So, when I was reading that, I was like, "Jessie, like, God is, like, male and female in one, and male
Exactly.
and female together are his image, we're his reflection, so we
Yes.
can't diminish half of God."
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
I heard Tim Mackey talking about kind of that creation narrative and how in Sunday school, man, you get the story that women were made out of the rib of man, like just that little rib, and then like we're made to be his helper. Like that's how it's presented to us, like as
Right.
women.
Yeah.
And then when you finally learn that no, 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 actually the Hebrew word is actually like split
Side.
into two, like Adam, mankind, Adam, split into two halves, male and female. Some like let me just take a little bit of your rib and make this helper fit for you. No, 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 no. It's
Exactly.
half. And then the word helper, how much of my life has that been taken out of context? Thankful too, like that you have done this, like as a man. Like we don't have, like, and I appreciate what you said before. Like I'm not here trying to like mansplain like what's going on for women, right? But we don't have enough male voices speaking up in this area. And so as a woman in the church, thank you that you are speaking up.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, I definitely believe in that idea of no more bystanders to sexism, right? And to use my privilege and my power to speak up for marginalized women. And I just feel like it's so often the case that we don't want to disrupt the boys club because we're fundamentally lonely. Or we're incredibly lonely. We've been socialized not to emotionally has been socialized not to emotionally connect. And so when we, in a sense, speak against and stand up to the norm, then we're fear of further isolation, right? And
And
so
it
it
happens.
sets that bind of like, wait, I want to belong. I want to be. We already connect so shallow in so many ways,
Yes.
and so it is a scary proposition. And yet, I feel like our deeper connection will be in advocacy and standing up to abuse because women have been doing it for so long, and yet so many women don't actually stand much of a chance because of the fundamental hatred of the feminine. So you can speak truth to power all day long and you'll still be dismissed versus if I can use my voice as a man to stand up against it, they don't know what to do with that. Well, wait a minute. I thought we were supposed to objectify women. I thought
Yeah.
we were on the same team here. They
You're
have to
at the table and you're like, "Wait a second,
yeah,
boys." That's a
exactly,
little different, right? They're not just gonna slap a scarlet letter on your chest,
right.
right?
But then they just dismiss me as, "Oh, you just hate men." So that's my yeah.
Okay.
'Cause those
So
are the only
try
options.
yeah. So they'll
Right.
find another way to just to try to dismiss me and which is the exact opposite. "Oh, yeah, I hate men. That's why I believe in them so deeply that they can actually change and transform." And I see them every month when they come to our men's workshop, these men who are doing the heavy lifting, emotional heavy lifting so that they can become good and safe men and not assholes. Like I believe in men so much. I want to call them to more because they're capable of more.
So let's throw some circles in here of kind of areas that we wanna name of unhealth in the church. We've already said sexism. I think these overlap, so the way church handles marriage and divorce. You talk about that in your book. That's a huge one. There's a lot of stuff coming to light about like the business model of church and kind of church as business, pastor as CEO model. And let's kind of talk about a few of these circles. And if you guys have any others to throw out that sort of overlap, and then maybe we can touch in each one of those, and then we can get to, okay, how can we, as therapists, knowing what we know about trauma, seeing what we see, how can we help the church, which I think is part of being the body? Like, these are the things we have to offer. How can we start kicking this ball down the field a little bit and making some things happen?
Yes. So I truly believe that poor reading of biblical texts. There's some problematic biblical texts that people have taken completely out of context. They don't understand it. They just read it and then they plop it. Well, that leads to damaging problematic theologies and teachings, marriage, and divorce, modesty, purity, grace and forgiveness, submission, headship, authority. These are all misconstrued from biblical texts that people have completely misinterpreted. And I believe, what Kevin Garcia writes, he said, bad theology kills, right? Or the quote from Emily Joy Allison, good theology bears good fruit, bad theology bears
Yeah.
bad fruit, right? I mean, it's
Yes.
really basic. So when we look at some scripture, and again, I won't go deep into it, but just quickly, some of the classic verses is what I take on, right? First Timothy, women should learn in quietness and full submission. And then First Corinthians, women should be silent in church. Those are kind of the classic clobber texts that are used to silence women. And so when you really go dive into them and really understand them more fully, the Greek word hashua, which is that was translated into be quiet, it actually means stillness. It doesn't mean be quiet. More along the lines of peacefulness or minding your own business. That is completely different. Women, be still. Well, sign me up for that. Sure. Yes. And then some of the thoughts of, there was apparently one or two women that were disrupting the services in the early church because they finally had a voice, because they finally had a place at the
Right.
table. And he's like, no, like, be still, chill out. Like, okay, I can get behind that. Right. That's so different than silencing all women for all time.
Right.
Right. You look at the word authoritarian, which says, I don't, translated, I don't permit a woman to have authority over a man. Right. So that's how it's translated. And yet, when you look at the actual meaning of the word, the origin of the word relates to abusing or misusing one's authority. So it should read, I do not permit a woman to misuse or abuse her authority over a man. Wait a minute. That must imply a woman does have authority. Do you see the absurdity of what we've done with these scripture verses where we have ordained misogyny? We have made misogyny God's voice when it's really, probably five, old white dudes making these decisions in some circle, like say, no, this is what it means. Like, no, it doesn't. Your misogyny is getting
Right.
in the way. And so do your research, because I believe responsible reading of the Bible is consistency, interpreting biblical passages. Because if you feel like 1 Timothy 2:8 silences women for all time, then you're going to have a problem contradicting Luke 24:9, John 4:39, Judges 5:7, Exodus 15:20, Esther 7:3. Like, good luck being consistent with that, right? Because Romans 16 talks about Priscilla was outstanding among the apostles, right? Phoebe was a deacon, right? Junah, outstanding among the apostles. Like, Philip had 4 daughters who prophesied. Like, you're not going to be able to be consistent because there's actually no hierarchy. So then back to your question. So those scriptures are misapplied, misinterpreted, and then that leads us to problematic theologies. So we shouldn't be surprised, right, that these teachings are done, right? And you mentioned Genesis 2, and the word of helpmate is ezer,
Connected, right?
Hebrew word right? There's nothing about subordination to that word. It actually derives from phrases to rescue, to save, or to be strong. The word Ezer appears 21 times in the Old Testament. Twice it refers to women. 3 times it refers to people helping or failing to help in life-threatening situation. And 16 times it refers to God as helper. In 8 of those situations, the word actually means savior. What? Savior? Right? So the word directly is followed by kenegdo, which means in front of him or corresponding with, like a mirror image. It has nothing to do with putting one person's life or one's goals in front of your own. And yet we've translated into this word of like hamburger helper, this like powerless subordinate thing, when really it more closely represents savior, rescuer. Maybe it's not about, women be more submissive and I'm the head, but actually maybe it's women are actually can help. Like we can save each other. We can invite each into something more beautiful.
There's
And
an
so
element of co-laboring that you hear in it.
exactly. So,
Team.
that
We're a team.
exactly. And so that leads into, your original question, which was even marriage and divorce, right? We have set up this doctrine that somehow marriage, no matter what, right, is the pinnacle of godliness. And we've completely distorted abuse, left out what happens in betrayal. What about betrayal trauma? And so these stories, I can't tell you how many times, I heard it from women. Greta shared direct quote. I've been told the solution to marriage problems is for women to cook more and have more sex, right? I promise you no amount of steak dinners or sexual favors will make your husband honor you and treat you as an equal. Marriage cannot heal abuse. And in many cases, it merely provides safeguards for protections for the abusers and guards them from being held responsible for their toxic behaviors. So we have to stop idolizing marriage and actually just, again, start telling the truth. I believe God is truth, right? The more we live in truth, the more we experience God. That is the invitation. And again, that's my own story. My own mom, uh, after years of my father's infidelity, even though he was a vice president of a Christian college, previously he was a pastor, my mom got shunned for leaving, but she wouldn't tell anybody what he did. She wanted to protect his image, and they wanted him to run for political office, because he was a high powered Christian. And so she just wanted to protect him even as we left. I remember a story of a woman finding out who my mom was in North Carolina because we had left a Christian community in Florida, and she wagging her fingers, your kids need a dad. And, she's a single mom, 3 kids after, my mom had been lied to, cheated on, thought we all had AIDS. Like, it's just like wild. It's so deeply personal for me. God, you take that verse, God hates a divorce or whatever. And this is like, God hates abuse. And once your husband betrayed you, he broke the marriage covenant, not you, right? God, we have to be more concerned with the people of God than the systems of God. The structures, the church, they're not made in God's image. The people are made in God's image. Same with theological constructs, right? And doctrine. We are so committed to defending this doctrine, we actually lose sight of the people that it's supposed to empower.
One of
So
my favorite podcasts, it's just my go-to, is Bama. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, Marty Solomon.
okay, no,
Like season 1 is just like, it's my go-to. But there was a episode where they were talking about the marginalized people, and maybe when they were wandering, I forgot the context of it exactly, but it ended up being, you can kind of tell a health of a church when you notice where the marginalized and oppressed people are.
yes,
Are they in the front or are they in the back?
yes,
And I was like, man, what would that look like if a church was known for having, the marginalized, oppressed people in the front, like right there, just being cared for, And I was like, man, we're missing the mark a lot in some of this. Cause where are the marginalized people, right? There's more church, like who can come in and who can't come in, right? People guarding the doors. I mean, physical barriers and emotional barriers and theological barriers.
Yes.
right? To keep this order, but that's not I mean, that's really the opposite of what Jesus did and the opposite of what Jesus said, and
Yes.
that's not the kingdom of God, right? That's how when the world is caring for people and abuse survivors better than the church,
Yes.
Right.
we have a big issue.
Exactly.
How we
Exactly.
gonna make it better, people?
Yeah. So what are some practical steps towards creating a safe church? What are the practical steps? And so some simple steps are, let's just start the conversation, right? I'm glad you guys are having this conversation. Like, okay, if 1 out of 4 women are in a domestic abuse situation, 1 out of 4 women, 1 out of 3 women have been sexually abused. That's wild. When's the last sermon you heard about domestic violence? When's
Right.
the last sermon you heard about domestic abuse? Like, if your church isn't having these conversations, like, okay, where? Let's start the conversation. Start a book group. Start, like, if they won't talk about it, will you talk about it? Right? Will you begin to bring it up? Also, how do we change? Like, let's start using trusted resources, researched resources. There's so
Thank you.
many terrible books in the Christian world that have become norm, where I actually think it's people's unaddressed wounds, and then they pathologize it, and then they pick and choose verses to defend their pathologies, and then that becomes the norm in church.
And that's again that what we started talking about is that unfiltered. I haven't unpacked any of my stuff. And
Right.
so it just automatically seeps out of me in
Yeah.
everything I do.
Exactly. Exactly. And so the next step, right? Start conversations, use trusted resources, also find your tribe, right? So if you're isolated more in a rural setting, hey, there's a lot of great communities online, a lot of great podcasts like yours. Find your tribe, find your people that are having this conversation, that are not scared to speak truth to power. And then finally, we have to start trusting our own power and our own gut. So many women have been gaslit into not trusting their own intuition because their intuition is dangerous, because their body has been sexualized and told that their body's dangerous, when I actually think God lives in your body. And so if you can learn to trust your body, you can learn to trust the voice of God inside of you. God resides in you, and your home is not bad. Jesus became human. You are good. And if you can trust your gut and your intuition, then you can begin to speak out of that place, which is a place of power. If you're a church leader, you got to start doing your own healing work. You cannot lead others where you have not gone yourself. So have you done your own story work? Have you dove into your own issues of femininity, of masculinity, of sexuality? Have you done your own story work? And then you can begin to develop and implement safeguards, policies that encourage safety, equity throughout the congregation. Some of those basic things are yearly abuse prevention training, criminal background checks, obviously. Make sure that everybody has familiarity with the procedures, the policies. Also, what I found and what I heard women asking for is open dialogue. Can we just talk openly about this stuff? So open dialogue sessions, hosting that. Those are healthier communities that talk about stuff. Because the more we talk about it, the less stigma there is around abuse, right? People can report sexual abuse because, oh yeah, like this is an open thing. This is not okay. And as we teach our young children, what is safe touch, what is not? And then finally, increase diversity in leadership positions. So many women would just ask, I just wish there was one woman that I could have talked to. I went to the deacon board. I went to the pastors, and I remember one specific story of a woman she was 18 years old. And this was a teacher at their Christian school, and then a leader in the church community. So kind of all one community. And he sexually abused her. And she was brought in to basically as the temptress, who had to apologize in front of the church and apologize to this man's wife and his daughter. And she just like, the moment that the pastor's wife came into one of the sessions, and he had called it, well, you had sex with him. And the wife actually stood up to her husband and said, well, actually it's called rape. And she can, which is, so it was like, finally somebody called. This is not mutual. This is
Named it.
literally a power over, not a power share. This is a teenage girl. It was just, she needs increased diversity in leadership positions because so many men are leading out of these blind spots because they hadn't done the work. And again, not saying all men are all like, we're not saying all men are bad or all, just we're saying diversity helps. It helps create and represent a variety of experiences. So those are just a few of the things to
I'd like
create.
to circle back to the first one when we're talking about domestic violence and how, that is portrayed from the pulpit. Last year, we were listening to a sermon, and there's a story that gets told, and it piqued my interest because this is a story I've heard growing up somewhere along the lines from the pulpit. And it's, the story of the wife who becomes a believer, and her husband doesn't want her to go to church, but she goes anyway, and then she comes home and he's abusing her, and it's like,
Class.
"Suffer well, woman. You are some." And I'm like, well, first of all, I don't think you can take, well, is this story real? First of all. Second of all, we can't take someone else's trauma and make it some,
Yep.
you know,
Norm.
norm. And and it's taking that verse out of context anyways. But it comes to this woman, it's your job to suffer well. Because you will win. If you treat him like a king, you know,
He'll
he'll
become.
act like a king kind of thing.
Exactly.
And of course, this is talking to, abusive situations, but that's the message. And I heard it growing up and I'm like, yeah, that sounds great. I'm going to suffer well for Christ. But to really understand, like, man, am I willing to accept that in my marriage? If my husband was doing that, I'd be like, wait a second. No.
I would love if to talk for a second about church structure as a whole and unchecked power. And then one of the things that Tiff talks about all the time that I love is this idea that there is no regulatory board for if we're going to stay in this current system, we got to have some kind of like regulatory, there's got to be something that holds people accountable.
That's part of the wildness, right, of the Protestant church is, whereas when you look at the Catholics and all the craziness and sexual abuse scandals, like there is, even though the corruption can go pretty deep, there is some checks and balances all the way up where the Protestants and, don't have that all the way across the board. It's just so splintered. And then you look at the Southern Baptist Convention and the abuses, you look at all these pastors and it's scary. It's scary to think of all these unchecked powers. And so the healthier churches will have that checks and balances versus just be very aware and very wary of the top-down CEO model where they don't seem to have actually any accountability, right? Or you look at, what was it, 2011, and, I was in Seattle with Mark Driscoll and trying to help clean up that mess. And you just look at, okay, this is a board who takes on the power. And then what happens, right? So, well, I'll just go start another church. Fine, see ya. And then just leaves thousands of families in ruins. And just finds, okay, I just need to have yes men around me. I just need to have people that will just submit to my authority. And so they'll just put people around them to help bolster their insecurities. So that's where it becomes very dangerous and very scary versus actually, can you find a leader who is humble, who is in an open-handed posture versus a threat? If your voice is a threat, run versus is your voice invited. Doesn't mean he's going to listen to, everything you say or every idea you have, but does he want to empower you? Right? Does he want you to start your own group? Does he want you to, yeah, that sounds awesome. Do you feel empowered? Do you feel like your gifts can be nurtured and used? Or is your voice a threat? Is your empowerment a threat? I'm reminded of Reverend Dr. Scott McKnight's quote. Yes, the church is part of the good news of Jesus, and the church proclaims the good news of Jesus. But when men and women have only seen churches formed by unhealthy power, celebrity, competitiveness, secrecy, and self-protection, and corporate ecclesial life belies the truth of the gospel. The church can only witness to the truth of Jesus by seeking justice, serving humility, and operating transparently and confessing and lamenting failures.
Yes. Yeah, that's my question that's been in my head is, what would it look like if, like, a paid position, you're receiving money, right, as a pastor, as the role, and if a pastor had to hold a pastoral license, like a clinical, like we have to, like, what would that how would that reduce harm within a church when there's an actual, a license on the line, you know?
Totally. Or just when I think of seminaries and, at least the seminary I went to required therapy, required therapeutic classes where the majority of seminaries you'll take one counseling class, some 101 basic counseling class, and then you're literally counseling people for the next 30 years of your career, you know? And I can't tell you how much over the last 15 years, how much mess I've had to clean up of just terrible counseling.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because when I think through that, I'm like, man, a church would feel a whole lot safer. Like when a client comes into my space, we go through informed consent. This is what we can do, we can't do. I just found out I was reminded of in South Carolina, we have to have in our disclosure statement that you are not allowed to have a romantic or sexual relationships with your clients, even up to 2 years after
Yep.
termination.
Yeah.
But we have to actually state that. Why?
Right.
Well, because the number one complaint in South Carolina is that, right? So as awkward as it is to tell a client, "Hey, just so you know, I have to tell you," because it actually happens and it's the number one issue,
There
but
you go.
they will feel safer in a space when they know the rules, when they
Exactly.
know. And with church members, everyone comes in, well, a lot of people wanna be able to come in and not have to have these boundaries. But then that
Exactly.
leads to this fallout versus even a pastor saying, "This isn't my scope," you know?
Totally.
Like,
And
it affects the pastor too.
exactly, exactly. So we're not picking on pastors. We're just saying, no, there's responsibility you have of, hey, this is out of my expertise. Okay, great. Refer on. Have a good referral network of trusted therapists. But it's just also, I mean, we're so far behind that as far as like in ministry. It's like, oh, I gotta leave the door open. I'm meeting one on one with a woman, and it's like she might want to have sex with me. No, no, she
Right.
doesn't. I mean, they think they're protecting themselves, and really, eh, it's actually just a very immature way of engaging.
All right, Dr. Bauman, thank you for being with us. Tell people where they can find you.
Yeah. Yeah, you can reach out. www.christiancc.org is our Christian Counseling Center and all of our offerings. And then I blog regularly at andrewjbauman.com. And I just wrote a piece. I think I posted it yesterday, what we were just talking about, entitled, I want to be like Jesus, but I don't want to be abused. What does that mean to want to be like Jesus and yet also not be a doormat? And so that's something women often find themselves. Jesus brings life, abuse brings death. Thank you.